Almost every American knows the name and believe that they know the story of George Armstrong Custer, if for nothing else, his defeat and death at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But Custer had a colorful career long before that fateful day, including service in the Civil War, and after that on the Western frontier. Who was the real George Armstrong Custer? What was his real claim to fame? How was he perceived by his peers and enemies? Did he really accomplish anything of military value during his career? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, military veteran, historian, author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. George Armstrong Custer was born in New Rumley, Ohio on December 5, 1839, into a large extended family. When rather young, he went to live with an older half-sister and her husband in Michigan. Custer did well in various schools and was hired as a young teacher for about 1 year. Growing up in a middle-class family with no political connections and a reputation as a rabble-rouser, somehow he did manage to obtain a recommendation to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point after he turned 18. Upon matriculating in 1857, Custer, despite being highly intelligent and gifted in many areas such as history, geography, Latin, Greek, and horsemanship, he was a disciplinary problem, earning many demerits and restrictions, and was basically a lazy student, nearly being expelled several times. Custer amazingly collected 726 demerits in just 4 years, almost setting a West Point record, and his dismal academic standing saw him graduate last in his class. The student graduating last is commonly referred to as the GOAT. His lack of academic achievement would have normally limited his future Army career, but with the Civil War having just started, officers were badly needed, and after he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, he was assigned to Washington, D.C. Despite his unimpressive academic record, the U.S. Army desperately needed officers to serve in the newly begun Civil War. He was commissioned a second lieutenant and then found himself in the proper location to make connections. Custer's baptism of fire was at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. His actions and methods, deemed reckless by many, impressed Union General George McClellan, who placed him on his staff. Custer then made a name for himself in a small way during the Peninsula Campaign that began in the spring of 1862, where he earned his growing reputation for both bravery and reckless leadership. Custer would take many chances that many of his peers and superiors would not. He was not a calculating cavalry leader, but more of an immediate reactionist. Throughout his combat career, while his men fell wounded and dead around him, he rarely sustained anything resembling a major injury. When he saw an opportunity, he took it. It became known as Custer's luck. Custer also became famous as a narcissistic publicity hound, never missing the opportunity to have his picture taken or give an interview to newspapermen who reported on the war. In fact, the Harper's Weekly newspaper attached a permanent reporter to Custer throughout the war because his name and exploits sold newspapers. In fact, Custer was the one officer they usually went to for a story, whether he was involved in an action or not. But Custer's luck endeared him to the senior Union leadership. He led by example in battle, never shirking or avoiding direct contact, even against superior numbers, much to the lament of many of his soldiers. Custer married a childhood friend, Elizabeth Bacon, when he returned home on leave in December 1862, despite her family not being very impressed with the young, unproven, and quite brash lieutenant. Known as Libby, she came from a wealthy and prominent business family, which was the reason Custer considered going into business after the war, as money was very important to him. General Philip Sheridan proposed to General Ulysses S. Grant that Custer should be given command of a regiment or even a brigade, And in the summer of 1863, the flamboyant Custer, the GOAT of West Point's class of 1861, was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 23, ahead of more senior officers, and assumed command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. Soon after, he began sporting an unusual and flamboyant uniform, which brought him even more attention. Custer, despite his arrogant and flagrant persona, proved to be effective, such as at the Battle of Gettysburg, where his cavalry screen located and then prevented General Jeb Stuart from attacking Union troops on their flank, and later managing to capture several hundred Confederate soldiers retreating south following their defeat. However, Custer's success and participation in the Union victory was costly, as his brigade lost almost 300 men, bearing the highest casualty rate of any Union cavalry unit. Perhaps the only reason he was never relieved of command was because he led his men into danger rather than ordering soldiers to their possible deaths. As the war continued, Custer would continue being successful, but his casualties would always be the highest in the Union Army, with an attrition rate averaging between 25 and 40%. This did not go unnoticed in Washington. Despite his mercurial rise in his professional fortunes, Custer was well known as a gambler and womanizer and had several affairs. He was even rumored to have slept with the wives of other officers, even targeting the widows of the men who died under his commands. Libby often traveled to where Custer was stationed, which was rather unusual for the time, and they never had children. She may have wanted to keep an eye on him. Yet, when they were separated, both were diligent and voluminous letter writers, and many of those letters still survive. Custer was still considered a very reliable cavalry officer by Major General Philip Sheridan, and Custer was with Sheridan during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign in 1864, where after fighting a series of skirmishes, he was placed on the cover of Harper's Weekly. Custer's cavalry unit was transferred to Petersburg, Virginia, where they participated in the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. Custer led a daring cavalry raid, one of the last in the war, which got him promoted to both Major General, albeit a brevet or temporary rank, and national hero status. Custer was with Grant and Sheridan at Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender, with his wife Libby also present. Sheridan gave the table at which Grant and Lee signed the formal surrender documents to Libby Custer as a gift. The war ended, and Custer's name and exploits were in almost every major national newspaper. His battlefield successes were sometimes exaggerated, but they always played to the fact that Custer was never seriously wounded, some claiming that he was anointed and protected by God. Such was Custer's luck. After the war, Custer reconsidered leaving the Army and going into business, but was convinced to serve in the Southwest, where troubles ensued with Native American tribes. To sweeten the deal, the 7th Cavalry Regiment was created, and he was offered command. Custer, now reduced in permanent rank to lieutenant colonel, as his temporary flag rank was taken away, met his troops after he and Libby arrived in Kansas in September 1866. The soldiers were all well aware of his exploits during the war, as well as his record of casualties. Custer was immediately involved in the military campaign against Sioux and Cheyenne in the spring of 1867. As was customary, platoon and even sometimes company-sized elements of his regiment would do scouting patrols, checking the condition of settlers and also the temperament and location of the Indians. Custer sometimes went on these patrols, and sometimes not. But when some of the men were killed in a fight, the survivors in their majority blamed Custer, believing that he had abandoned them. And on a few occasions he did abandon his command, and it was during one of these absences that the soldiers were killed. Custer was brought up on charges of abandonment and desertion. He had actually been spending time with his wife. The resulting court-martial found him guilty, sentencing him to 1 year without pay and loss of his command, and he and Libby returned to Michigan. Given the task of quelling the restless natives, Sheridan formally requested that Custer be returned to duty as soon as possible. The War Department relented, and Custer was reinstated. Returning to duty, and out to prove himself in this new theater of operations, Custer attacked a Cheyenne camp along the Washita River in Indian Territory, which is now modern-day Oklahoma, in November 1868. Custer claimed that his men had killed a large number of warriors, which could not be confirmed, but it did pacify the area for a time and was the Army's first major success in the region. The action was highly publicized, and Custer soon became a household name once again, but U.S. citizens were not the only people taking notice of the man the Cheyenne called Yellow Hair. Then a problem arose that had to be addressed. Prospectors discovered a small deposit of gold in 1864, but a much larger gold deposit was found in Deadwood Gulch in November 1865 in South Dakota, and thousands of prospectors flooded to the new town of Deadwood by 1876. The problem was that this area was still Sioux territory and was still under the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 with the U.S. government, including the territory of Wyoming, that it would not be intruded upon. Under intense pressure from politicians and looking at a tough re-election, President Ulysses S. Grant issued the order in 1875 that all Sioux would have to leave the Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming by January 1876. The government knew that the Sioux would be unable to exit the territory during the notoriously brutal winter, which the War Department took to interpret as failure to comply and justified military actions. The U.S. government now had a major problem, since the primary leaders of the Sioux resisting the invasion included Sitting Bull, a Hokpampa Lakota chief and highly revered holy man. Since Custer had provided army protection to the gold miners who encroached upon sacred burial grounds, and tensions in Washington were growing. As a result of the miners invading the area, which led to a few small skirmishes, Custer was brought back to Washington for a formal hearing. Custer was accused of allowing the miners to enter the territory, violating the Treaty of Laramie. But in his defense during his testimony before the congressional hearing, Custer deflected responsibility, refusing to be the fall guy, the scapegoat, and he clearly implicated several members of the Grant administration as being responsible. There was also another problem. The U.S. government had entered into the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, with lands granted to both nations. The tribes never lived on the lands, considering it unworthy and restrictive, which did not allow them to follow the buffalo herds. Those Custer claimed of furthering U.S. expansion and expulsion of the Sioux, violating the treaty, included Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, Secretary of the Interior Zachariah Chandler, Attorney General Edwards Pierpont, Secretary of the Treasury Benjamin H. Bristow from 1874 to 76, and his successor Lot M. Morrill, Secretary of War James D. Cameron, and his predecessors William W. Belknap and Alphonso Taft. Custer had just outed the men who wanted the territory at any cost, and he made a lot of enemies in the process. He also exposed the corruption stemming from Belknap, who resigned on May 2nd, and Orville Grant, the president's brother. Belknap and Orville Grant were involved in setting up monopolies at frontier posts, forcing out any competition and setting very high prices, exploiting the settlers and the soldiers. There was also the issue of Indian Bureau agents working with both Belknap and Grant in stealing the food and supplies promised to the Native Americans and then selling them at higher prices. Custer also became a pariah after leaking the details of the expansion in violation of treaties and the details of the hearing to the national press. Washington could no longer contain their ambitions, and they blamed Custer. Custer proved they were responsible. President Grant was said to have been in a rage, and he removed Custer from his command and had him arrested when he tried to leave Washington and return to his troops. It took the efforts of several high-ranking generals such as William T. Sherman, Philip Sheridan, Winfield Scott Hancock, and James Crook. All of these generals and many others sympathized with Custer as they knew the truth and they intervened on his behalf. Grant finally relented, bowing to the pressure, and allowed Custer to return to his command of the 7th Cavalry. Otherwise, it would have been a political disaster for Grant. The U.S. expulsion campaign began in May, which prompted former enemies to come together as close allies for their mutual survival, such as the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Chief Sitting Bull requested the unusual gathering, which was also attended by Dull Knife of the Northern Cheyenne, Crazy Horse of the Cheyenne, Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota Sioux, and others previously mentioned. The Grant administration had just instigated a war with the most famous warriors of the Plains Indians, with an estimated 2,000 and 4,000 warriors and their families, totaling between 6,000 and 10,000 Indians in total, depending upon the sources, that gathered along the Little Bighorn River in Montana. On June 25th, only 5 Arapaho representatives arrived: Left Hand, who was half Blackfoot, half Cheyenne but adopted by the tribe, Yellow Eagle, Yellow Fly, Well-Knowing One, and Waterman. After several long days in reconnaissance, Custer's scouts located the large camp. The Arapaho in general were not interested, and when the 5 arrived at the camp, they were disarmed and threatened with execution, as the Sioux did not trust them, until, as stated by Left Hand in an interview with Colonel Tim McCoy in 1900, to quote him, "Two Moon, chief of the Cheyenne, went to the Sioux chiefs and told them that we were Arapahoes and that they must give us back our guns and set us free, which they did, but they watched us closely so we could not get away." Custer, deciding upon the element of surprise, chose to attack, dividing his 210-man command into 3 elements to each attack the camp from both flanks with a frontal diversionary charge. Custer and his men did not survive, and there was some speculation that Major Marcus Reno, his executive officer and support element leader, was one of the officers who resented Custer, blaming him for the 1867 massacre of 7th Cavalry soldiers. Both Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, who was supposed to prevent the Sioux from retreating, joined together and did not support Custer, with conspiracy theorists suggesting they allowed these men to die. The bodies of Custer and his men, including his brother, Captain Thomas Custer, a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient in the Civil War, were discovered 2 days later. The 36-year-old George Custer and the others had been stripped of their clothes by the Sioux women, but not scalped, and his body had a single bullet wound to the chest and another in his head. The sole survivor was a Comanche scout, and, according to his and opposing Indian accounts, the battle lasted almost 2 hours, with the soldiers unable to handle the Indians using powerful and deadly repeating rifles. The news of the defeat shocked the nation and stirred a lot of racial prejudice against not just the tribes involved, but all Indian nations. In fact, it was the catalyst for an even more aggressive U.S. government push deeper into the Western Territories, sparking another 2 decades of unrest. Libby Custer dedicated her remaining years writing a series of best-selling books about their life together, Custer's career, and maintaining his legacy and legend, which made her even more wealthy until she died in 1933. George Armstrong Custer has been both deified and vilified, but whatever you think of him, he was a brave man who took incredible risks. The man, called Yellow Hair by the Indians, at least kept his own hair even in death. Thanks for watching today's episode of Forgotten History. If you like this episode, please consider becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon page. This would help us offset the ever-increasing cost of production. As always, please like, share, and comment. And if you have any show ideas, please contact us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.